Hello, welcome to Module 3.3. Why should we care about inequality and poverty? So in this section, we're going to go over the question of how much inequality is too much inequality, how much poverty is too much poverty. We'll take a look at some characteristics of inequality and poverty across developing countries as well as a couple of developed countries. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll take a look at the notes that are on Canvas. And so here, the first question we're asking is inequality efficient? And so, it's a difficult question because, if we had, probably perfect equality is not efficient just because people differ in terms of their productivity, in terms of their work ethic. And we want to make sure that people have an incentive to work harder, to increase their human capital, and therefore earn more. And so there's always going to be a little bit of inequality in the sense that some people are more productive, some people are working harder, and they should be compensated for producing. That being said, there may be such a thing as too much inequality. So we want to make sure that countries are able to reach their full economic potential. And in order for countries to do that, they need to be able to utilize all the resources that they have. And a big major resources that countries have are the people that live in that country. And if you have a system where there's very limited economic and social mobility, if the situation that you're born into determines, your potential outcomes in life, then this could potentially lead to an economy that is missing, some great opportunities. Who's to say that the next great entrepreneur, the next person that comes up with some, new great technology that really drives economic growth in that country forward isn't being born into a situation of extreme poverty. And so we want to make sure that there is what we call equality of opportunity, that everybody has the same chance, right? Now, what they do with those chances, that's on them, but we want to make sure that everybody starts on a level playing field. And, to that wit, here are a couple of reasons why too much, excessive, may actually be inefficient. So the first thing is that if there's a lot of inequality, then a large section of the population has limited access to credit. Now, when we think of credit, financial markets, one of the benefits of having a vibrant market is that, let's say that you have an amazing idea, but you don't have, any collateral, you don't have any income, you're starting off poor, but you got a great idea. And let's say that I have some money, but I don't really have great ideas. Well, we could connect with each other in a financial market, and I could fund your idea, and that benefits me because I'm going to get a higher return by investing in you than I would by investing in myself. And you benefit because your great idea now gets off the board, even though that you don't have any, capital. But in a lot of developing countries, financial markets are not that efficient. And in order to participate in financial markets, you really do need to have a lot of your own capital to begin with. And so if you got a lot of income inequality, then a large section of the population effectively is shut out of these credit markets, which means that there's a large section of the population that is being constrained by their resources, not being constrained by their ideas, not being constrained by their work, by their productivity. They're being constrained by the situation that they're born into. And so there's a lot of opportunities that don't get realized when you have limited access to credit for a large share of the population. Another observation that we see is that in a lot of developing countries, we tend to see actually, on average, lower savings rates for the very rich than we do for those in the middle class. And so, if we were able to shift a little bit of income from the top to, let's say, to the middle, we might observe an overall increase in total savings in that country. And that's important because savings is what's used to finance investment. Investment requires capital, both physical and human, and that's what really drives a country forward. And so we want to make sure that we are not, putting most of the country's income in the hands of people that aren't going to be saving as much, or maybe if they are saving, they're saving it outside of the country. And so that's another thing that we tend to observe in a lot of developing countries is that the very rich don't save that much within their own countries. They oftentimes part in the financial markets of more developed countries. And so the developing country is missing out on, having that money being reinvested back in. Another issue we run into is if there's a lot of inequality in income, we might observe a lot of inequality in education. And so if most of the wealth is concentrated at the very top, then what you're going to observe for investment in higher education at the expense of primary education. Now, that's not to say that investing in university education is a bad thing. It's great, right? I mean, I wouldn't have a job otherwise, right? all of you are getting higher education, and it's a wonderful thing. You're learning skills, but we tend to see our diminishing returns to education. If you had, $100 and you could invest it in improving the quality of primary education, invest in improving the quality of higher education, you're going to get a bigger social return by investing in primary education. Basically, the country is better off when everybody in the country is literate, has basic math and organizational skills, the kind of things that you're learning in primary school, than if you had a very small group of people in that country that have a lot of education, right? But everybody else, lacks the fundamentals and the basics. So we want to make sure that, we are investing our money in terms of education where it's going to yield possible return. Now, a lot of times what you see in developing countries, it is not sexy to invest in primary schools. You want to, shining universities that you can show off as a beacon of, how advanced you are. And maybe in terms of political optics, it looks better, but in reality, you be better off, shifting that money towards basic primary education. And another, reason for this is expensive, basically, to increase, expand higher education than it is primary education. So, if you want to hire university faculty, you got to pay them more than you would, for example, a third grade teacher. Even though that third grade teacher, in terms of social benefits, might be actually generating a higher return. So I know I'm talking against my own career here, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the biggest bang for your buck in education is at the lowest levels of education. Okay. Another issue that we run into, inequality, where you have a small group of elites that are sort of controlling the economic system, political system, then it's an inequitable system for those that are not part of the group. And the elite group is benefiting a lot from having that kind of a system in place. Here, back to our discussion from the last module of kind of institutions that let a small elite subjugated majority. And so that small elite group wants to make sure that their position is protected. And so they may then, money that we would hope they would reinvest back in the economy, they may engage what's known as rent-seeking behavior, where basically they're benefiting from the situation that they were born into, and they're spending money to make sure that they maintain that privileged position in society, rather than investing it back in the letting it grow. And so, if there is a tax country that is regressive, meaning that the rich are paying a lower share of their income in taxes than the poor are, well, you might get a situation where the rich then are lobbying the government or, outright bribing the government to make sure that we don't get meaningful reform to the tax system to make it more progressive, such that the higher burden of taxes is going to the rich. Now, if they're spending all that money lobbying the government, that's money that they're not spending reinvested back in the country, and that represents a large country. And then finally, if we have a situation where there's a lot of economic inequality, then this can lead to political instability. If a lot of people see, hey, I've got nothing, but look at these people, they are living, with just ridiculous amounts of income, lavish houses, and they're just spending money left and right. That's the sort of situation where people see, like, well, this isn't a good system, right? We need to make change. And oftentimes when you have countries where there's tremendous amounts of inequality and you have a small group of elites that are ruling over, a subjugated majority, then that's seeking behavior. But the other thing that they'll do is they'll engage what's known as populist economic policies. And so you can basically buy off dissent by, giving people, some little crumbs that will appease them. Oftentimes in really authoritarian countries with a lot of inequality, you'll see food. So the government will give people, free food, or free bread is a big one in the Middle East. Oftentimes you'll see fuel subsidies or electricity subsidies, these are sorts of things where, people don't like the system, but at least they're getting, some little thing. And that's enough to appease them. That's enough to stave off, any kind of political revolution that might actually occur. The problem with these populist subsidies is they're expensive and they're not sustainable. So I'll give you an example. Here's a picture of gasoline subsidies in Iran. Basically, this is a gas station in Iran the day before the government was set to reduce the subsidy that they gave to gasoline. So basically, prior to this, gas was like, I don't know, it's like 35 cents. It's in the notes, the exact number. Yeah, 34 cents a gallon in Iran, so to consumers. So basically, people are like, all right, well, the government sucks, but at least gas is cheap, right? But unfortunately, that's not a sustainable, because the true price of gasoline is a lot higher than that. I mean, the true price is, let's say, 250, like that. That means that the government's on the hook for that difference, and they're spending all this money to maintain this kind of a subsidy, especially in governments in countries where there's not efficient tax collection, where the economy is being constrained, possibly because of excessive inequality. These sorts of policies, eventually the government just runs out of money in order to pay for it. So in a country like Iran, where most of government revenue comes from oil sales, all it takes is for a crash in oil prices for a country like this to be unable to maintain such a subsidy. And so basically, they had to increase the price of gas from 34 cents a gallon to a buck 37 a gallon. It was still below the true price of gas, but it was a big increase in price. Obviously, this pissed off a lot of people. It's not surprising that there were some pretty strong and rampant revolts or revolutions, protests against the Iranian government right after this happened. Ultimately unsuccessful in bring on regime change due to a pretty aggressive crackdown by the Iranian military and police force. But it was clear that this exposed the vulnerability of this authoritarian regime to the fact that it really was relying on these kinds of populist policies in order to be able to stay in power. And if these countries cannot maintain these kinds of policies, then they really do political instability. And in fact, these policies themselves, even if they are able to maintain them, oftentimes are a waste of resources. I mean, gas subsidies. I mean, if the government passed a law that dropped the price of gas to 50 cents a gallon, you might be happy about that. You're not paying as much for gas. Well, the problem with it is that people are going to drive a lot more because gas is cheaper. And so that's going to make the subsidy more expensive to the government because people are buying a lot more of that cheap gas than they had planned on, probably. It's certainly going to have a big environmental cost. You're going to have a lot more cars on the road, which is going to lead to not just more pollution, but you're also going to have more traffic fatalities, more time wasted sitting in traffic. It's going to stump the growth of alternative fuel technology. There's all sorts of costs associated with these kinds of populist policies. Okay, so that's an explanation for why we might not want to have too much inequality in a country. So what is the relationship then between economic growth and inequality? As countries grow and develop, does inequality go up? Does it go down? What's the relationship? And it really is going to depend on how that economy is growing. And so we're going to define three different, what we call typologies of growth. And in this model, we basically have sectors. We have a traditional sector that intensively uses unskilled labor. So you can think about this as like basically low agriculture or the textile industry, or something that doesn't use a lot of capital or skilled labor, but it's mostly where the unskilled workers are employed. And then we have a modern sector. The modern sector intensively uses capital, skilled labor. So with those two sectors, we have unskilled workers that are concentrated in the traditional sector, and we have skilled workers that are concentrated in the modern sector. Unskilled workers, on average, almost always, are at the bottom of the income distribution. Skilled workers, owners of capital, are at the top of the income distribution. Okay, so let's say that the economy is growing through an expansion of the traditional sector. So this is traditional sector enrichment. We'll assume that labor is not mobile between those sectors. So if you're an unskilled, you are unable to acquire the skills to move into the modern sector. We'll relax that assumption later, but for now, assume that you can't move from sector to sector. If growth is being driven by okay, sorry about that. Internet dropped for a second, so I'll edit this and make it more seamless. So we were talking about typologies of growth. And so here we're referring to, for example, we just talked about traditional sector enrichment, which increases the demand for unskilled workers, raising their wages, decreasing inequality. The opposite of that is modern sector enrichment. Modern sector enrichment basically is when growth is being driven by an expansion of the modern. So the modern sector is basically the one that intensively is using skilled workers and owners of capital. Basically, if the modern sector grows, let's say that there's an expansion and sort of highly complex manufacturing economy, then we're going to see an increase in wages going to those skilled workers, to the owners of capital. We're going to make more. And in modern sector enrichment, we assume that unskilled workers cannot acquire the skills to the modern sector. So what we'll observe is unskilled wages don't change. Skilled wages go up, owners of capitals, incomes go up, and that's an unambiguous income in income inequality. Okay, so those are two sort of extreme examples. And then the last one we'll talk about is where we're going to relax the assumption that unskilled workers can't acquire the skills to move into the modern sector. So with modern sector enlargement, we're assuming here that labor can move from the traditional to the modern sector. Maybe this doesn't happen right away. It takes a while for workers to acquire skills. It might even take, generations, right? So, maybe somebody working in the traditional sector is not able to move into the modern sector, but if they see that the modern sector is growing, maybe they're going to invest more in the education of their children so that their children become skilled workers. So it might be a slow process, but we assume that eventually unskilled workers can become skilled workers. Okay, so modern sector enlargement, growth is being driven by the modern sector. And initially, what we're going to observe is an increase in demand for skilled workers, increase in capital. And so wages to skilled workers, incomes to capital owners goes up, inequality rises, just like modern sector enrichment. But with those higher skilled wages, what we're going to see is unskilled workers acquiring the skills that they need to move into the modern sector. This is going to do two things. First, there's going to be an increased supply of skilled workers. So there's more skilled workers than there were before, and an increased supply of skilled workers is going to drive the wages of skilled workers down. The second thing that happens is that there are unskilled workers. And with a decreased supply of unskilled workers, then the wages for unskilled workers is going to go up. And the expectation here is that unskilled workers are going to keep on moving from the traditional to the modern sector until that wage gap that existed before the expansion of the modern sector is restored. So what we'll observe is inequality first goes up as wages to skilled workers and capital owners rise. And then as unskilled workers move into the modern sector, inequality is going to come back down. We will end up where we started. So this is sort of the theory that supports something known as the Kuznets inverted U-shaped hypothesis relating income and income inequality. So the economist Simon Kuznets basically was describing this process of modern sector enlargement. And so basically as a country grows, initially we're going to see an increase in inequality because of the expansion of the modern sector. But eventually over time, workers are going to transition from the traditional to the modern sector, and that's going to drive inequality back down. Now, we could look at this over time in a single country, or we could look at this in a cross-section across countries. And so basically, Kuznets' story here is that if we did a cross-section of countries, and so we've got gross national income per capita on the horizontal axis, and we have inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient on the vertical axis, then what we'll observe is that the highest levels of inequality are not for the poorest countries or the richest countries, they're for middle income countries. So these poor countries here have not yet experienced an expansion of the modern sector. The middle income countries have had an expansion of the modern sector, but unskilled workers have not had the time yet to acquire the skills to move into the modern sector. In rich countries, skilled workers have become, they've moved into the modern sector and inequality. So what is the empirical evidence on this? We can look at this in a couple of ways. So first, let's take a look at a cross-section of countries. And so here I've got a couple of high-income countries, some upper middle income, lower middle income, and lowest income. Kuznets' hypothesis is basically that the countries here in the middle, the upper middle income, the lower middle income, are going to have the highest levels of inequality. Their average inequality is going to be higher than countries and the poorest countries. And if we look at these Gini coefficients, okay, sorry, dropped out again there. So as I was saying is that we don't see that perfect inverted U shape because obviously there's other things that influence inequality. So in the US, we have, for example, a tax system that on the surface looks progressive, but there's a tremendous number of sort of tax write-offs and loopholes that tend to benefit those at the top more at the bottom. We also have a lot of institutionalized things that lead to more inequality. Certainly we see more inequality if we're looking, between, racial groups, if we look at gender, things like that. I mean, there's a lot of sort of institutionalized things that lead to higher levels of inequality in the US. Whereas, you have countries like Haiti, for example, which also have these sorts of institutions that lead to more inequality. You have real limited economic mobility. You have an education system that really benefits the rich more than the poor. So we don't want to just look at income. Obviously, there's determining inequality, but it does look a bit of evidence, for this. The other way that we can look at Kuznets' hypothesis is to look at what's known as longitudinal data. So longitudinal data look at individual countries over time, but then all cross sections. So we have countries in the cross section observed at multiple points in time. And so what I have here is basically an example of this longitudinal data. We have 5 countries observed over, I think it's on average about 6 years, a little bit more for some countries, a little bit less for others. And what you see here is that if you were just to look at all these points together using this longitudinal data, you do get a little bit of evidence of this inverted U, right? So it does look like the highest levels of inequality are sort of happening for this middle income, not the poorest, not the richest. And then if we look at individual countries, we'll get a little bit of evidence of the inverted U shape for Brazil. So here we have a number of different income measurements for Brazil, and the highest levels of inequality are not for the lowest level of income, not the highest level of income, but the middle levels of income. We get a little bit of evidence also of this, for example, for Costa Rica, only 4 data points, but it does look like inequality is highest at sort of that middle measure of income for Costa Rica. However, we also have Hong Kong and Singapore, which present completely the opposite relationship, where the highest levels of inequality are when those countries were either the poorest or the richest, and actually the middle income was a little inequal. Then you have a country like Pakistan, which has really no relation whatsoever between inequality and income. Basically, its income doesn't change that much, but the inequality is all over the place. So, I mean, again, it really just comes back to the fact that there's a little evidence for this sort of modern sector enlargement theory, but we need to also remember there's other variables that are influencing inequality. Okay, the next thing we want to move on to is poverty. And so the first thing we'll take a look at is what's the relationship between poverty and economic growth. So here, basically a diagram of the poverty rate in the United States from 1959 to 2018. And what we see is there was a big decline in the poverty rate the 19. Now, a lot of this driven by expansions of sort of government safety nets and social welfare programs. But really, since the beginning of the 1970s, there hasn't really been any kind of long-term trend decline in poverty in the U.S. So I mean, it's gone up and down. That sort of mirrors expansions and recessions in the country, but there hasn't been, a steady decline in the poverty rate, even though the U.S. has experienced real growth in income over the same period. Now, a lot of this is driven by the fact that a lot of the real growth in income in the U.S. has been concentrated to gains at the very top of the income distribution, not those people that are susceptible to being in poverty. So, this does beg the question, what is the relationship between growth and poverty? And it's not obvious, right? So there might be some reasons to believe that actually poverty rises as countries develop. So, for example, let's say that modern growth is being driven by, let's say, an expansion of industries that intensively use skilled labor, that intensively use capital, that modern sector. So it might be that if there's a certain section of the population that's unable to adapt, that is susceptible to having their job, for example, become automated, right? So if you were working factory that used more labor than capital, and then new technologies led them to automate more, you might have lost your job. Maybe you got another job, but it wasn't unionized, didn't have the same kind of benefits, paid lower wages, and that sort of thing that could potentially lead to more poverty if there are people in the country that are unable to adapt to technological progress and change. We might also see that if you try to reduce poverty in a country, this may lead to less growth and development. So if you're utilizing all your resources to redistribute money from the rich to the poor, maybe this creates disincentives. People don't want to work as hard. There's a drop in investment. So it's possible that trying to stop poverty or trying to reduce poverty may actually cause growth rates to go down. That being said, there's a number of reasons why we might think that reducing poverty is actually economically efficient. So not even talking about whether it's the morally right thing to do. Here we're just saying that it's actually a good use of the economy's resources in terms of reducing poverty will actually lead to more growth. So much like we talked about with inequality, if you have a lot of poverty, then you have a lot of people that are shut out of credit markets. And again, we don't know that next great entrepreneur is not going to be born into a situation of poverty. And so we want to make sure that everybody has a level playing field, no matter how poor or rich they are. We also, again, see that in rich countries, in developing just people tend to have relatively low savings rates. And the empirical evidence suggests that they tend to have much higher rates of consumption on luxury goods. Now, in a developing country, almost all of the luxury goods are imported. So that means that they're essentially sending money out of that country. And even when they save, more often they're likely to save out of that country. So that money is not necessarily being reinvested within the country. Other issues you run into, if you have a real high rate of poverty, then those people that are in poverty may experience bad nutrition, bad health, especially if it's childhood malnutrition. This can have lifetime effects on cognitive and physical development, which will lower their productivity over the course of their life. And so again, you're not utilizing all the resources in your country. If you can increase in people that are at the bottom of the income distribution for the poorest people, then again, the empirical evidence suggests that what they're going to spend that money on is more likely to be a locally produced good, right? So, if somebody's, just barely struggling to get by and they increase their income a little bit, they're not going to Mercedes or, putting that money in a Swiss bank account. Probably going to the local market and directly putting that money back in the economy. And so increasing income for the poor is more likely to have a local direct stimulus effect than increasing money at the top of the income distribution. And then finally, if we can reduce poverty, if somebody is, on the verge of starvation, if they are just struggling to get by, they don't have the time, the energy to fully engage in the economic and political process, right? All they're really concerned about is survival. Give people, enough income that they get out of that pure survival mode, then that gives them the ability to pursue those careers that they're the best at, right? That gives them the opportunity to send their kids to school as opposed to having to have their kids work so that the family doesn't starve. If they have, enough income that they have the energy, the time to devote towards political movements, then this can lead to meaningful change, at the grassroots level in a country. And so, we want everybody in the economy to be, participating in the economic process. We want everybody to be participating in the political process. And poverty is one of the reasons why people won't fully engage in these processes, because they simply don't have the time or the energy to do it. And so out of that state of poverty, we're going to get broader participation, and it's going to be more likely that the economy is fully utilizing all of its resources. Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about in this section is take a look at some characteristics of poverty groups. So the reason why we want is that if we're going to craft policy, which we'll do in the next section, that is targeting poverty or even inequality, we want to figure out who it is that we should actually be targeting. Who are the poorest people in these countries? And so we'll take a look at a couple of different sort of general trends in poverty. The first is rural versus poverty. And almost all, in most developing countries, I should say, we see much higher rates of rural poverty as opposed to urban poverty. And so, not terribly surprising, there's more economic opportunities in urban areas. The kinds of jobs that are there tend to be higher paying. Rural areas, people are much more likely to be working on like subsistence farms, and less likely certainly to be, owning property. Educational opportunities, especially for women in a lot of rural areas of developing countries. And so, it's not surprising that we see much higher rates of poverty in rural areas. So, for example, if you take a look at a country like Zambia, 60% of the population is below the national poverty line. But if we're just looking at the rural population, it's about 78%. The urban population is 27%. So much worse rates of poverty in rural Zambia than in urban Zambia. We see this situation repeated over and over. For example, if we take a look, even in a country, not even in a country, but almost every country on this list basically shows higher rates of rural than urban country. Chile is the one exception where the poverty rates are not that different, slightly higher in urban areas. Now, is that if you look at most poverty reduction policies, they tend to be focused in urban areas. Now, there's two reasons. The first is it's just cheaper to implement policy in an urban area. You have much more population density. It's easier to reach a lot more people in an urban area just because more people live in one place than it is in a rural area where transportation networks, communication networks are a lot more expensive to traverse. So for that reason, we tend to see more poverty reduction policies focused on people in urban areas. It's cheaper. The second reason is that urban populations tend to have a more political influence. Part of that is just that you have more people in one group. It's easier to organize. And so, governments oftentimes, if they are going to devote resources toward poverty, they're going to do it towards those groups that, are basically speaking with the loudest voice, that have the most influence. And that tends to be those in urban areas, though the real problem of poverty is in rural areas. And, in developing countries, large portions of the population do live in these rural areas. Okay. The next thing we want to take a look at is gender inequality in poverty. Also, gender inequality just in income, political representation, and everything like that. So we tend to see really high rates of poverty, higher rates of poverty amongst women than amongst men. And also, we tend to see the highest rates of poverty for single mothers. Uh, and this is due to a wide range of factors that unfortunately we don't have enough time in this course to cover. But just to throw a few out there is obviously there's gender discrimination. Women don't have the same kind of economic opportunities as men. We also see that families oftentimes in poor countries, the poorest families in the poorest countries, will invest more in the education of their sons than in the education of their daughters. And a lot of the times it's that they have limited resources, and they see that a dollar spent educating their sons, because men in many of these countries have more economic opportunities than women, is going to yield a higher return. And they'll do that. And so, this is the sort of thing that unfortunately becomes sort of institutionalized within the country. So in a lot of these places, what you see, for example, this is the ratio of female to male secondary education in a country like DR Congo. Basically, women are about half as likely as men to have a high school education. If we look here, for example, the ratio of female to male labor force participation, it's almost universally below one. Higher in some countries than perhaps you'd expect, but certainly what we're seeing is that women are participating in the labor force at lower rates than men are. Now, this is, obviously there's fewer economic opportunities for women. And so that again makes sense. Also, if there's less education, that would make sense. And then why these sorts of programs become institutionalized, this sort of inequity becomes institutionalized, political representation in these countries. Even in a country like the US, which, we like to think of as, developed and advanced and blah, blah, blah. I think a lot of that sort of fantasy has been dispelled over the last week or so, in terms of everybody having equal access for everything. What we see, 25 seats in Congress, even though women represent actually slightly more than 50% of the population. So you don't have proportional representation by gender here. And if you want to change the way that a country runs, you need to have representation that people that are for the rights of these groups. And so it's pretty clear that that these sorts of inequality become indoctrinated within a country, and the kind of changes that need to be made are those sort of fundamental changes that increase the level of education that are going to women, that increase opportunities for women, and increase political participation. Okay. And then the last thing we want to take a look at is differences in poverty across ethnicity, race, religious groups sometimes. And so here what I've got is a chart of the poverty rate in the US from 1973 to 2018 by race. And what you see here is that there's been a pretty consistent difference in poverty rates between whites and Black and Hispanics. And so the poverty rate on average is about 10 to 15 points higher. The share of these populations that are below the poverty line are much higher for racial minorities in the US. Now, it's been a little bit of a convergence over the last, let's say, 10 years or so, but it's still, a pretty severe. And again, a lot of this stuff is institutionalized in terms of differences in educational opportunities, differences in employment opportunities, certainly differences in incarceration rates, differences in the way treated. This is something we'll come back to later on in the course, but it's pretty evident that obviously there's a lot of racial inequality. Focus on reducing poverty. We really need to be able to identify where is this the worst and what's causing it. This is not something that's just a U.S. problem. We see this all over the world. One last example that we'll take a look at is some poverty statistics for the Roma, or technically the Romani people in Europe. So this is sort of an ethnic minority that sort of traces its ethnic sort of background to northern India, but have been scattered throughout Europe, the U.S. too. Actually, I think they're one of the largest populations in the U.S., parts of the Middle East, really all over the place. And historically, especially in Europe, been viewed very negatively. Even to this day, there's a lot of pejorative terms for the Roma people. And so, in these three Eastern European countries where the Roma represent a pretty significant share of the population, you can see massive differences between poverty measured Roma and the non-Roma people. So, for example, the poverty headcount at $2 a day, most of these countries have really low headcount ratios for the non-Roma populations, but huge ones for the Roma populations. Here, if we look at, some of the deprivation, you can see, that Roma people, for example, in Bulgaria, 12% of them have a telephone line, whereas 81% of non-Roma people do. Those that are living in houses with a leaky roof and a dirt floor, this is sometimes as much in some cases, than the non-Roma people. So clearly big differences in living standards, in poverty between some of these groups. And so it's important that if we're going to create policy, that we identify what's causing and driving this poverty. If we're observing poverty for these kinds of groups is institutionalized discrimination, then that's what we should focus on. If the reason is a lack of economic opportunities, then that's what we should focus on. So that's going to be the point of the last section in this module. And stay tuned for that video. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you soon.